Dagmar obtained her doctorate in history from the University of Oxford with a thesis pertaining to the life, work, and, thank you, political activism of the international pacifist, feminist, and suffragist Rosika Schwimmer. Previously graduating in literature and modern languages, she also holds a second PhD degree in American Studies. She lectured, tutored, and published extensively in the academic fields of gender, post-colonialism, critical theory, and cultural criticism as well. So her fields of interest indeed are women's and gender history, life writing, and peace and nonviolence studies.
Thank you for your kind introduction, and hello everybody to our last session. As my abstract is not in the workshop booklet, just allow me to briefly start off by outlining what I aim to cover in this very short talk today. Regarding the time frame, I'll focus on the interwar period, as most of you have done with your papers as well, so hopefully we can facilitate some synergies here. I will, however, begin in the First World War in order to contextualize women's political efforts a little bit better, namely with the so-called International Congress of Women in The Hague in the spring of 1915. And then I will move on to two examples of two quasi-women ambassadors, Vira B. Whitehouse and the slightly more successful Sarah Wambau. And here I'll also bring in the transatlantic intersections mentioned in my abstract with two US women engaging in humanitarian and political activism in Central Europe generally and the former Habsburg lands specifically. Now, permit me to begin my talk with the so-called International Congress of Women in The Hague, where 1,136 female attendees from numerous countries convened to contemplate about how to bring the First World War to an end and to draft practical resolutions for mediation. And I'm especially interested in the Congress's aftermath, a tour de force through Europe by two women delegations, journeying the neutral and belligerent nations and visiting practically every pertinent statesman in Europe, with some even being received by the Pope or crossing the Atlantic for audiences with President Wilson. These pacifists, suffragists, and feminists, descending from various cultural backgrounds and religious denominations, did not simply traverse borders, and quite literally, not simply metaphorically, front lines, but also challenged and tried to deconstruct the status quo of patriarchy, militarisms in conjunction with masculinities, and male-dominated diplomacy, which to a certain extent continue to persist to this day. Now, very swiftly, who were some of these pioneers of female diplomacy? Hull House co-founder Jane Addams, and the first female MD of the Netherlands and doyenne of the Dutch women's suffrage movement, Aletta Jacobs, representing the neutral countries, headed the delegation to the belligerent nations. The Hungarian pacifist Rosika Schwimmer, whose passionate plea we see up here, and the Scottish lawyer Crystal Macmillan from the belligerent states visited the neutral governments. Accompanied by their entourages, these lady ambassadors toured the following countries, and let me just reel them off in alphabetical order. Austria, Belgium, Britain, Denmark, France, Germany, Hungary, Italy, the Netherlands, Norway, Russia, Sweden, and Switzerland. In less than 3 months, these women conducted 35 interviews with leading officials in practically every capital of Europe. And we actually do have original video footage of Jane Addams and Aletta Jacobs in Berlin being greeted in front of the Brandenburg Gate by male representatives. The third woman in this video is the US physician and actually first female professor at Harvard, Alice Hamilton. It's a very brief clip, 20 seconds. It's 103 years old, so I think it's worth watching. So bear with me. now back to the PowerPoint. Okay. The mere fact that these envoys' itinerary crisscrossed all over Europe amidst the biggest war ever waged on this continent was already a curiosity and spectacle in itself. Their wish to talk to crowned heads and government officials was simply an outrageous and preposterous novelty for their times. This endowed the delegations with an aura of uniqueness, but at the same time undermined their actual political impact and message. Pacifist women received more attention than most other peace proponents, yet their clout was restricted to symbolism and sensationalism. The dichotomy of stereotypes ranged from benevolent portrayals of them as naturally born dove-like peace angels to dilettantes and wannabe attachés, tampering with affairs beyond their understanding. And naturally, as you can imagine, the press feasted on this with many derogatory cartoons like this one. By embarking on their trips to individual European governments and officials, these female cohorts did not simply break every taboo because they ventured into traditionally masculine domains of diplomacy and ambassadorial efforts, but also exercised strategies that were still alien to their contemporaries. And the ministers they visited, in turn, understood that receiving female pacifists was a safe exercise to demonstrate civility, chivalry, and goodwill without political liability due to the private nature of these conversations. It was exactly this gallantry which precluded the envoys' political or diplomatic leverage. Meeting women did not send the same message as exchanging ideas with male representatives. As private, disenfranchised, and feminine-labeled persons, they were denied any political authority or significance, which paradoxically preconditioned their receptions in the first place. Or as David S. Patterson remarked, and I quote, "One can plausibly argue, in fact, that the European statesmen did not take the women seriously and only humored them in order to make a good impression on neutral opinion," end of quote. And here, for instance, we see the ladies visiting King Haakon of Norway, and actually their taxi driver circled the palace to verify whether they actually got in because he couldn't believe that they had an audience with the king. From a historiographic and socio-political perspective, these women envoys contributed to galvanizing a paradigm shift regarding germane and visible roles in the political sphere for female citizens, who at that time were still being deprived of basic rights, such as the franchise, in many countries. Moreover, the women in The Hague and their succeeding missions of female delegates established a certain form of parallel diplomacy as an amateur version, existing laterally to official negotiation tables and hence violating the unwritten code of war and peace politics. Although the Great War, as the first total global and media war, introduced temporary new roles for women out of necessity, exerting influence on the diplomatic forum was not one of them. Even when it came to post-war negotiations and treaties, female activists played not even a minor role. This is even more tragic in that these women envoys specifically and private peace initiatives generally played their fair share in the birth of modern conflict solutions taking shape after 1918. Many of their blueprints for mediation were adopted and fostered by future organizations and systems. Hence, the irony of the women's peace efforts is quite blatant. While they were overwhelmingly slandered, scorned, and accused of being either pathetic or bizarre by their contemporaries, their mediation template crystallized into being acceptable in the 20th century and became increasingly professionalized by institutions like the United Nations. And may I add and conclude this introductory section with the fact that the WILF, the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, which actually sprang forth from the women's meeting in The Hague in the spring of 1915, as a feminist equivalent to the United Nations today, is still lesser known worldwide than the actual United Nations. Now, a swift change of gear and scenery with two examples of women who could, if only briefly and modestly in the case of White House, play at the post-war political table with the boys, so to speak. And here we also have the transatlantic nexus with Central Europe after the Great War. Weira B. Whitehouse was appointed as the director of the Swiss office of the United States Committee on Public Information, or short CPI, in Bern by President Wilson in 1918. And interestingly enough, she published a book entitled A Year as a Government Agent in 1920, recounting this experience. Married to the New York stockbroker Norman R. Day Whitehouse, Weira had gained prominence in the New York suffrage campaign by chairing the Publicity Council of the Empire State Campaign Committee in 1913 and the New York State Women's Suffrage Party in 1916, and thus was a leader in securing suffrage for New York women in November 1917. Whitehouse was well acquainted with Wilson, himself not a proponent of women's suffrage, and she actively lobbied for the women's cause in Washington. All these circumstances would not have made Whitehouse a natural choice as CPI representative in Switzerland if it had not been for her good contacts to the then CPI chairman, George Creel. Not being an Ivy League graduate, and moreover without any higher education whatsoever, Creel himself, in fact, was an unorthodox choice for this post. By the time Creel was appointed as CPI chairman, he was looking back on a flamboyant journalistic career and activism in the women's suffrage campaign. He actually got to know Whitehouse through this suffrage activism in New York, and regarding her highly, finally pulled some strings to engage her in international politics. Whitehouse herself saw the appointment in Switzerland as an opportunity to rectify her reputation as an unpatriotic and subversive woman based on her feminist suffragist past, and she tried to rehabilitate herself in Washington. Due to her work ethics and leadership merits she had displayed during the women's suffrage campaign in New York, she indeed was highly qualified for the Swiss CPI job, albeit she gravely lacked the basic language skills for such a diplomatic post. It also has to be emphasized that Switzerland was a very useful and pertinent base for the CPI. Its geographic location and polyglot setup were quite significant for post-war negotiations. The appointment of diplomats to Switzerland thus entailed crucial importance beyond gender issues. Switzerland, again, only fully enfranchising its female citizens in 1971, was perhaps not the ideal territory for sending female political representatives in the first place. As Creel was not anonymously accepted as the CPI chairman in Wilson's cabinet either, Whitehouse's mission was complicated and quite openly boycotted from the start. Male secretaries and diplomats in both Washington and Bern were suspicious of Whitehouse, her feminism, and her suffragist history. This dislike of Whitehouse also resulted in a cover-up of her mission, mainly by Creel, as merely investigating the situation of women and children in Switzerland in order to fly under the radar and not evoke any further negative attention. So Whitehouse's agenda subsequently became forged and orchestrated with explicitly humanitarian and hence very feminized for maternal and caretaking tasks, when in fact the original meta-text to her stay was rather a mandate, and I'm quoting from the unofficial documents in her archive, to combat and counteract German propaganda and make plain the aims of the American people, end of quote. This was to be achieved mainly via news agencies and the press in Switzerland, by distributing articles and pamphlets, and by showing motion pictures dealing with American events. So basically a propaganda bureau, we might say. Thus, the CPI was also responsible for issuing press releases to the former Habsburg territories, because the disintegration of the dual monarchy also increased additional concerns in the White House about potential Bolshevist revolutions spreading in and from these areas. Wilson therefore issued a so-called appeal to the peoples of the constituent nations of Austria-Hungary, and it was White House's task to disseminate this address swiftly and efficiently. Accordingly, this message was translated into, again in alphabetical order, Czech, French, German, Hungarian, Italian, Romanian, Ruthenian, Serbian, and Slovak for publication, and sent to all corners of the former Habsburg lands, also alphabetically, Croatia, Galicia, Poland, Slovakia, the Tyrol, and Vorarlberg. However, this accomplishment did not earn White House any credentials with her male colleagues. Palpably, White House's mission, which had to happen under the most adverse conditions, then was used to reinforce political gender segregations and assumptions about supposed female diplomatic inferiority. Appointing women as diplomats was not simply considered effeminizing and weakening this privileged profession, but also insulting the country they were sent to. In military and non-military circles, a female ambassador signified disrespect for the host nation in question. In the diplomatic service and international relations, a newly created term after the First World War, women were at best permitted to pursue surrogate politics and auxiliary or administrative, not executive or representative duties. As Helen McCarthy argues, for instance, only from 1946 onwards, so after another world war, were British women realistically considered and recruited as diplomatic deputies, and the marriage bar for British women emissaries was lifted in the 1970s. Furthermore, this post-1918 scenario corroborated social patterns on a wider scale and harked back to and consolidated the gender dimensions during the actual belligerent conflict. As, for example, Susan Graysel's work shows, even within the new term and concept of the home front, women were constrained to very specific roles. Alongside the traditional spheres, the home front was gendered feminine, the war front gendered masculine. As women still had to fulfill feminized duties and man masculinized within these apparently new world orders, the total war effort did not subvert traditional gender prerogatives. Accordingly, conventional gender parameters continued to exist after 1918 and were sometimes even reinforced to stabilize post-war societies and counteract economic or political crises. Above all, control over procreation also became a hot issue after the decimation of the population as a result of the war, and many women were banished to the home in order to make room for the returning soldiers on the labor market. Since the total war effort then merely allowed women access to restrictive roles as feminized carers, as for instance nurses, or as substitute workers in occupations otherwise reserved for males, as for example ticket conductors, they remained marginalized on political platforms, and this paved the way for anti-feminist arguments, which were openly articulated through the exclusion of women from the official peace talks in Versailles. After all, female negotiators were feared to be too lenient and passive in their demands towards the defeated powers. Now, permit me to conclude with a less bleak example of yet another US woman politically active on the international stage by carving out a feasible professional niche for herself after the First World War, and her work, interestingly enough, is directly related to the northeastern Adriatic region with its gender demarcations parallel to the geographic ones. So this was Sarah Wambau, an American political scientist who became recognized as one of the world's leading experts on the subject of plebiscites. Wambau graduated from Radcliffe College in 1902, and she remained at the college as an assistant until 1906, while pursuing advanced studies in history and government. For a decade thereafter, she worked with the Women's Educational and Industrial Union of Boston and took part in the women's suffrage campaign. In 1916, she resumed her studies at Radcliffe, and in 1917, she was awarded an MA in International Law and Political Science. In that year, she undertook a study of the theory, practice, and history of plebiscites, a field then new to systematic study. And one might argue this is exactly why she could venture into it, similarly to the women at The Hague who anticipated and practiced peace-building processes later usurped by patriarchy. And as a footnote, Wambau was highly interested in the Hague meeting of 1915 and collected data about it. In fact, Wambao's monograph on plebiscites, with a collection of official documents published in 1920, so the same year as Whitehouse's oeuvre, and first prepared for use at the Versailles Peace Conference, established its author as the leading authority in the field. From 1920 to 21, while studying at the LSE and at Oxford, Wambao worked in the Administrative Commissions and Minorities section of the League of Nations Secretariat. Thereafter, she helped observe, plan, and administer a variety of plebiscites and advised governments and international bodies on the subject. For instance, from 1934 to 35, Wambao collaborated on the Saar plebiscite, and in the latter years she lectured at the Institute for Advanced International Studies in Geneva. She also served as an advisor to the United Nations mission that observed the Greek elections of 1945-46 and was engaged in administering a plebiscite in Jammu and Kashmir in 1949. Quite symbolically, the Wambao archives were discovered by mere coincidence in the basement of the Harvard Law School library in 1970. And they encompass a goldmine of correspondence and evaluations about plebiscite affairs with regards to the political, demographic, and sociocultural situation in the northeastern Adriatic region, especially emphasizing the Carinthian and southern Alpine zones and the referendum in 1920, and furthermore, its global positioning and relevance in interwar times, for instance, for contrastive analysis concerning case studies of Tacna Arica in South America and the Saar. Most importantly, the material valuably illuminates women's role and impact both as diplomatic observers and residents or voters, and actors or contributors in gender-related and multi-ethnic democratization dynamics during the aftermaths of war. And Wambao's interest actually was a continued one, as we can see from this clipping of the 1940s. So amongst other territories, for instance, the Saar area, Wambao was a keen and astute observer involved in the Carinthian plebiscite of 1922 and published prolifically about her work and experience. Incidentally, as a brief digress, I've also unearthed in the regional archive in Carinthia correspondence between her and local Carinthian officials who tried to utilize her assessment of that region for their NS interests and purposes. And there's another odd detail, because she was awarded the so-called Knight Cross First Class, which apparently is an Austrian Order of Merit, in 1935. Wambao's angle of insight into the northeastern Adriatic region and situation as a stranger and foreigner to both the geographic lands she was visiting and female emissary in exclusively male-dominated realms helps to shed alternative light on this transitional period through the prism of gender. Substantially, the Wambao storyline and biography relate to several of Irene's research objectives, such as politics and political violence, as she reported on the logistics of realizing the referendum amidst inter-ethnic conflict, but additionally to subcategories of the four major work packages, like, for example, intellectual women and their role and humanitarian engagement in shaping post-conflict trajectories, including democratization processes. A particularly significant feature and aspect is the relevance attached to her by her to this 1920 plebiscite in the international post-war landscape by pragmatically depicting the geographic, economic, and social environments in Carinthia juxtaposed to the lands then occupied by the SHS forces. Further, her academic discourse interfacing with the subject of post-war migration, borders, and citizenship is imperative because it provides a female outsider's perspective on the East Adriatic region, certainly with a colonial connotation to it, and definitely not unbiased or devoid of global, that is, US political interests. However, and more importantly so, it is the interpretation of a female political executive, a species rare for her time, Hence, I would like to conclude with excerpts from Wambao's narrative of the region. These quotes are taken from her staccato-style travelogue, which she kept during her journey there from June to September in 1922. So here we go. Present peaceful, drove up to top of Leubel Pass to look over into JS. Pass long and steep. From top, look in direction of Laibach, now Ljubljana. Great stone columns marking frontier have new names painted on. Drove back through St. Jakob or St. Jakob in Rosenthal, which is actually too small to be on this map here, and around Tiny Lake, which is summer resort for Southern Europe. Line between zones ran through lake, and before plebiscite commission came, people skating across line or rowing over it arrested and taken to Laibach. Little feeling between those Windisch, so Windisch is actually an old German term for Slovene, both for the people and the language. It's quite interesting that she should use this one rather than Slovene. Little feeling between those Windisch who voted for JS and Austrians. Few Windisch intellectuals to keep it alive. JS consul growling about cave he was given for office. On the whole, however, the situation is tranquil, and the peasants, being prosperous, are seemingly more than content with their red and green glass balls spelling opulence in their gardens. End of quote and end of presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your interesting presentation, and that's why I'm immediately opening the question round. Okay.
Thank you, Dagmar. That's so great, because I've written about Sarah Wamba before, but I never knew that the archive was in the Schlesinger Library. So that's such a find, really, because she's mentioned a lot. People read her, but they don't know anything about her. I was just wondering, in terms of White House and her status in Switzerland, do you think then that, because the woman you work on, Rosika Schwimmer,
Yeah.
she's there as a diplomat.
Exactly. I made a point today to myself that I will not mention
I know.
Rosika at all, except for this one quote about the mothers.
Yeah,
So.
except that, I mean, I do have a question about that. So there's Rosika Schwimmer, Alexandra Kollontai, and then there's White House. Is it that in fact, in some ways, you can't put them together because there's, well, actually, Schwimmer's seen as she's the representative of a liberal Hungarian state, but is there a way in which whatever women from Hungary or Russia are doing doesn't matter for what the status of someone like White House, that in fact she exists in some context that is really about Western Anglophone even women, so much more relevant to the British examples.
You mean White House?
Yeah,
so, exactly. Yeah.
I mean, I know you just made a choice not to include Schwimmer, but if you do put White House back into a picture with Schwimmer and Kollontai, what would you say about it?
That's a fantastic question, and I did not want to elaborate on Schwimmer today because I've given so many papers on her. It's a very good point. In fact, Schwimmer, of course, is sort of the first unofficial woman diplomat of modern times because, of course, she was recognized by Károly and his government grudgingly. There were only 3 people, Károly and Sándor Gisvány, and interestingly, Stefan Zweig, I found a letter by him to Schwimmer, translate from German, in the archives, save whatever you can save. So there were 3 men supporting her, but even the Károly National Council was against Schwimmer being sent to Switzerland. So she remained an unofficial woman diplomat of modern times, and of course the honor is for Alexandra Kollontai to have the official title. And of course, Schwimmer then in Switzerland was not accepted either, not simply because she was no guy, she was Jewish as well. There is a very abysmal quote in White House's book by the American minister in Bern, who of all first names is called Pleasant A. Stovall, who describes Schwimmer to White House as being of the 3rd race. And White House, I don't know whether she really didn't know about it or claimed naivety, mentions in her book, I didn't know at first what he meant. So Schwimmer was in a way ostracized, not simply because she was a female diplomat or an emissary not recognized by the other nations or other states. But the point between Schwimmer and Whitehouse is further intriguing, because when Schwimmer goes to the States in the autumn of 1914, when she realizes in Europe she can't sort of lobby for mediation and stopping the war because the British feminists, first and foremost Millicent Garrett Foster, sort of try to get rid of her and ship her off to the States, and Carrie Chapman Catt is welcoming her because she wants Schwimmer there to lecture on women's suffrage because there are crucial referenda coming up. Whitehouse is not meeting Schwimmer in New York because Schwimmer is too radical. And this point apparently, so that Whitehouse distanced herself from Schwimmer in autumn of 1914, this sort of enemy alien pacifist, I mean the States were not in the war yet, but still, that actually she sort of rehabilitated herself in the White House for that, and that's how Creel could push her into this position, because Wilson understood that she did not liaise with Schwimmer. And of course, we all know about the devastating interview, the first interview in 1914 with Wilson when Schwimmer gave an unauthorized press interview, and then Wilson refused to see her again. So this is one part why Whitehouse also got that job in Switzerland. I didn't mention that, because she actually managed to distance herself from Schwimmer in 1914. The other part is this translation of the message by Wilson that actually Schwimmer was useful for Whitehouse to accomplish that task. So I didn't really want to elaborate on Schwimmer today. So this is the only time they cooperated together, because that was the least evil. They were the two women ostracized in Bern. Schwimmer knew all the languages, and Whitehouse relied on her to have this message translated swiftly and efficiently, and then actually also distributed personally to all the areas Schwimmer then travels through for Adelberg and the Tyrol. And there is this fantastic passage in Whitehouse as a year as a government agent. She saw her off. I mean, Stovall would not give Schwimmer any certificate that she was sort of an official carrying that message. Whitehouse saw Schwimmer off in Feldkirch in Vorarlberg, and Schwimmer, although she tried to look very self-confident, looked kind of forlorn at the border when she traveled then on to Hungary and distributed that message. So this is the only time they cooperate. And then when when Schwimmer, of course, is persecuted in Budapest by the Horthy people and desperately tries to get out, she contacts all people, Carrie Chapman Catt, for instance, and also Whitehouse, to help her get sort of across the border, and Whitehouse again ignores her as well. So this is sort of the complex narrative surrounding Schwimmer and Whitehouse. Yeah.
Go ahead. Are we too tired?
Lunch and the weekend are waiting, so I do understand that everybody wants to dash off.
Okay. Thank you very much, Dagmar. And now, yeah.